With the new My Lowe's Pro Rewards American Express card, earn 3 points per dollar spent on Lowe's qualifying purchases for the first 6 months after card account opening. Plus, save 5% every day on eligible purchases at Lowe's and earn points on eligible purchases everywhere else Amex is accepted. Card members get more at Lowe's. Subject to credit approval. 5% can't be combined with any other offer. Exclusions and restrictions apply. Points subject to loyalty terms at Lowe's.com/terms and credit reward terms at Synchrony.com/MLPRA-terms. Visit Lowe's.com/business credit.
Shane, when we look at the Detroit Lions, and Dan Campbell, the head coach, is not going to be the one using this as his narrative, but they have a lot of excuses maybe for falling off last year with the injury history that they had, and it's such a critical determinant of success in the NFL, as we know, and the difference between winning a Super Bowl and not even making the playoffs can be just that bit of injury luck. I mean, it's no coincidence that the teams that finished first and third in the least games lost due to injury by their starters last year were the New England Patriots. I say the New Orleans Saints, the New England Patriots and the Seattle Seahawks. So, you know, that's not the only reason why they were the two teams in the Super Bowl, but it certainly played a key role in helping them navigate their way through a tough regular season and through the grind that the playoffs can be. Lions, on the other hand, got very little luck with injuries, and they also were coping with the departure of the two coordinators. A lot has been made of that, but again, not by Dan Campbell. They have Drew Petzing joining as offensive coordinator this year. A lot of good things expected of him. They have a new DC in town in Kelvin Shepherd, and they hope to have the key contributors back and fit. Unlike the Minnesota Vikings, about whom we've just been talking, they have the quarterback in Jared Goff, who they can rely. They have the playmakers around him that they hope to rely on, minus Khalif Raymond and minus David Montgomery, yes, but with Isaiah Pacheco coming into the building, who we expect to do exciting things alongside Jahmyr Gibbs in that running game. How do you see the 26-27 season for the Lions? Can they roar back?
It's a difficult one to tell, because roaring back in for the Detroit Lions doesn't just mean making the playoffs. It means being dominant in the way that we've seen the Lions be dominant in this current era that we're seeing. What I'm worried about slightly, and like last year, I figured that they wouldn't make the playoffs based purely on the loss of coordinators, but they've shown themselves to be organizationally tough enough to negotiate past it. But then the injuries was what sort of pulled the rug out from underneath them. What I'm looking at this year is they really changed the sort of inner mentality, not only in terms of how they're advertising themselves, but in terms of the way that they're training, the way that they're acting, the way that they're playing football, in a way that I don't know if it's conducive to them not being injury prone next year, as a key number of those players who have been such an important part of what the Lions have been get a little bit older, get a little bit more miles on the clock. Talk about Goff, Gibbs, St. Brown, Hutchinson, obviously being a big one that was missing for big chunks over the last couple of seasons. And Pacheco as well, who I think is a good pickup. Certainly a very serviceable running back. Again, it's similar in terms of that there's a lot of miles on the clock going on for a significant chunk of those players. And I don't know if you saw, like, it's weird to read into this, but in terms of trying to get what the mentality inside the camp is, do you remember during the schedule release videos, everybody had something fun, everyone had something crazy. In the case of Arizona Cardinals, everything they had something crap. But for the Lions, it's just a case of Dan Campbell nailing, we're getting down to business up in the door, and that's it. There's no discussion, there's no anything else. And even you're reading a lot of stuff what people in Michigan are looking at this team, and they always note about how sometimes when they get into training camp, when they get into OTAs and stuff like that, that it can be really, really intense. And that intensity is what's like, you know, the great strength of the Lions. The same way that their ability to go for it, that they're all guts, no glory, is their greatest strength. But we've seen consistently over the course of this Dan Campbell era that their greatest strength, what makes them so different, what makes them so lovable for us to watch, is also their greatest weakness, in that it becomes something which makes a deck of cards fall. You know, bad game management in the case of the NFC Championship game a couple of years ago. And I think this could end up, we've seen last year, one of the big things coming back from this is maybe bad player management, making them a bit more prone to injury by playing and training so tough. I want to just compare this to the difference in Arsenal this year. One of the reasons why Arsenal won the league this year compared to previously is because Mikel Arteta took his foot off the gas instead of training them even harder and harder and harder in the tail end of the season. And they managed to just about get over the line and win the league. Not very convincingly, but the change of mindset and the change of when something goes wrong it's not, the answer isn't always to work twice as hard. You need to let a bit of rest and try to get a bit of a culture back in. I don't know whether
you need to find out how to foul people at set pieces without getting called on it.
Yeah, I suppose
that kind of helped as well, Shane.
Yeah, a few phone calls to the PGMOL probably has as well. But in the case of the Lions, I mean, and this is the thing, like when they changed the coordinators, you're wondering, is there enough outside knowledge? Like obviously they're still having Calvin Shepherd, who of course is very much came up through the Lions system in there. So on defense, you're not expecting much to change. Offense, maybe there's a bit of a change there in terms of how they approach things. And look, if Gibbs gets firing, we're going to see some great stuff. If Amon St. Brown, I'm looking forward to seeing in Germany gets firing. Well, hopefully not against the Patriots, but I'm looking forward to seeing, like, there's got to be some fantastic stuff there. There's a hell of a lot of talent in there. But I just think it is worth mentioning before we get into camp, in terms of when we're watching how early some of these players are going down, because there are some teams over the league that have bad luck with injuries, but you have to wonder, is it luck or is it the way they're actually being managed? We talk about some circumstances around the 49ers. I just wonder whether the Lions are almost taking themselves a step too seriously, that leaves them in a position where the Vikings, they get a bit of free-flowing defense. The Packers and the Bears, both great potential to be Super Bowl champions this year, can easily outpace them, and they realize that maybe their era is gone. I realize I'm negative with the Lions. I've always are.
We're actually favourites to win this division, as we mentioned at the outset.
How the Lions are favoured over the Bears is ridiculous. But we'll argue with the Packers. Who's putting them over the Bears? Anyway, I don't. That's we'll get on to that in a second. But I'm traditionally
who they
quite
beat
negative
twice last season. But keep talking, Shane.
70 games of the season. I still think there's look, I'm always gonna have questions with the Lions until they go in the final dance, and I'm just worried about the way that they've acted so far. It's almost just feels too serious, too rigid for the flow and the art that they sometimes be able to show on their offense to really flourish.
Kieran, it's going to make for a great America's game if and when the Lions do manage to win the Lombardi, because we've seen them so close to the top of the mountain, and we've seen that clip over and over again of Dan Campbell, and it gets referenced all the time, and I'm going to reference it again now for good measure, saying maybe this was it. Maybe this was the best chance we get, when they lost that NFC Championship game to the Niners last year. And Brian was talking about this on another podcast about the hangover of coming close and not getting there, and what that can do to teams the following season. They did seem to suffer a little bit from getting upended by the Commanders in the playoffs last year, when everything was going much more smoothly. The injury luck, as Shane has been outlining in detail there, really didn't go their way last year. But there were signs, like even with the coordinators gone, and even with the up and down nature of the offense, when things clicked into gear, they were the irrepressible force that they had been in previous years. Like, there was a quote from Tyreek Stevenson at the Bears cornerback I was reading in the offseason, because the Lions put 50 points on the Bears in week 2 and beat them again later on the season. Tyreek Stevenson was saying, I don't know what happened out there. No one's ever put 50 points on me before, not even in a video game. Like, they can be that good.
Yeah, they can. It's interesting. As Shane was talking, I was wondering, it's like you read my mind, because I was wondering, to a Lions fan, what would represent progress this season? I mean, are people expecting them to get back to the NFC Championship game, or would people be happy for them just to climb the ranks of the NFC North and make the playoffs and maybe win a playoff game again? What's the level of expectation in Detroit? Because I know you can talk a lot about Super Bowl windows and peaking, but there certainly has been a feel to the Lions that maybe the peak was 2 seasons ago. And that doesn't mean you don't always have to win a Super Bowl at your peak. I mean, you can win a Super Bowl in a lot of different ways. It's not to rule them out or count them out, but you do feel like that all the momentum was with them 2 seasons ago. And yeah, these windows can come and go and pass teams by very quickly. It's interesting what Shane was saying as well. And to Shane's point, it seems as though Dan Campbell may have been learning lessons in this offseason. You talked about the schedule release and getting down to business. And you know, he talked about the OTAs he called it a pajama party, and that he didn't want to talk about who's making progress because it's just a load of hot air when they're not in pads, you know, and everything like that. But we had Trevor Thompson on from Believe in Lions, and
Campbell has been so chippy in the offseason. Like, as Shane mentioned, like the all business schedule video, like a lot of the comments around the coaches' meetings and and so on. Like he was like the great line about the Rams. Well, why don't we just give them the trophy now? Like he's not a happy man. Like he's pissed off.
Yeah. But as I said, we had Trevor Thompson from Believe in Lions on a few weeks ago on the show, and he gave us a great insight into the mindset in Detroit. And it seems as though Dan Campbell is taking some heat to what's gone on the last 2 seasons. He talked about how he's thinning out the preseason program, and they certainly are going into this off season with a certain level of caution. I think they've only playing three preseason games and a lot less. A lot less gung-ho contact early on in the season, and they're not expecting a huge amount of starters to play. So it's certainly wrapping a few guys in cotton wool, but they need to do that, because when you look at key areas, and especially in their defense, you look at Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph coming into this season banged up, and you're wondering when you're going to see those two guys who are, leaders on this on the defense. You look at the Terry Arnold situation, you're going to be without him in the secondary anyway.
He could be locked up, never mind, banged up.
Absolutely. But what does help them this season is a softer schedule, is particularly at the start of the season. I think they've four of the first 5 games are on paper very winnable. I think it's they have the Saints, the Cardinals, the Jets, someone else, and then the Bills kind of in the middle of that. So, I mean, there is potential for them to kind of, for want of a better term, ease into the season before the real tricky schedule or the tricky run of games comes. But look, there's still huge potential on this, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. If they can get the offensive line right in front of Jared Goff, what he can do and the weapons he has on the outside. We've talked about these guys over and over again in the last season, and you add in, and what did Kieran call him, the electric car in Tesla, on the outside, and what he can do on top of Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams. Sam Laporta, one of the best tight ends in football, who again needs to be eased into the season with coming in with an injury. So I think again the ceiling is very high for the Lions. It's a different kind of a division to the West. We were talking about the West, and we were talking about these powerhouses a couple of weeks ago. The teams in the North, they all have really high seasons, but there's still a lot of questions over, I think, each and every one of them. We're not as fully optimistic about them. Maybe the caution is the fact that two of us have skin in the game here. We don't want to give too much away or pin too many colours to the mast early on, but certainly that they can come into the season with a degree of cautious optimism.
Craig, in terms of the roster turnover, and Kieran mentioned some of the additions there and also the retentions and the key skill players that they still have on the books there. But we have seen a couple of notable departures during the offseason. Taylor Decker, Graham Glasgow could be a big one. Alex Anzalone, who's been a great contributor at linebacker there for them. Again, every roster, to the greater or lesser extent going into the season, has that level of churn on it. But it is notable enough in Detroit. You've got a couple of new coordinators coming on board and you have a couple of key departures. That lack of continuity isn't the easiest way to plan your way through an offseason.
No, and there are 2 big names that I actually think are probably on their weakest part of the roster, which is that interior defensive line. They lost DJ Reader and Alim McNeil, both departed, or with McNeil just diminished, really. But that's a really big area of concern. And actually, it's the 2 lines that really look the most interesting to me. Like I just said, with that defensive line, no replacements there, the fact that they might struggle there. They do have good pass rushers. They obviously picked up another one with Derek Moore in the second round, edge rusher there. So he's going to be an immediate starter, really opposite Aiden Hutchinson. And they're going to hope that those 2 can solidify the edges. But it's that interior there that worries me. But then you flip over to the offense, and we've spoken about the weapons that they have. And, yes, they lost David Montgomery. So we've lost Sonic and Knuckles, which has now been replaced by someone who said Sonic and the Tasmanian Devil, which doesn't really roll off the tongue in the same way. But Pacheco is there. They have the very, very good wide receiver room. They have the tight end there as well. So that's great. But their offensive line last year was an absolute atrocity. Really, really bad. And it all went because of Frank Ragnow and the fact that he retired. And then they've still were using Penny Sewell at right tackle because they'd obviously moved him to take effect for left tackle Taylor Decker, who was playing there. And it just didn't really work. They were 31st in pass block win rate, 20th in run block win rate, despite being a top 5 unit the year before in 2024. They allowed 39 sacks, which was 18th. their offense still miraculously had 120 rushing yards per game. I have no idea how they did that, but that offensive line really, really didn't look great. But I do think that they've done quite well this offseason with what they've done. Saul's moving back to left tackle. They're going to have a new starter at left guard. They picked up Mays at center, which is some people are calling the best pickup of the entire offseason because they needed to make sure that they did that. They obviously got Juice Shrugs as the backup center who came as part of that Montgomery deal. Tate Ratledge is going to be at right guard. Miller, their new right tackle, who was their first rounder, he's going to slot in there. So it is a rebuilt unit that could have massive impact on what happens with the Lions this year, because they only ever seem to work when the run game is dominating games. And when the run game dominates games, then Goff has the ability to pick and, do the little dink passes, and they get the yards after catch, and Amon-Ra St. Brown really sort of fires on all cylinders. When that doesn't happen, and that's what happened with the collapse at the end of last year, where Dan Campbell took over the offensive play calling, they had that great win against Washington, and then just tanked themselves offensively and really, really struggled through the back end of that season. And I think if they turn that around, then there's no reason that they can't be favourites for this division, because they do have the 6th easiest schedule out of all teams in the NFL. The NFL is not played on paper. We all know that. But having the 6th easiest schedule is always going to help. When you have the teams like Kieran mentioned, they also have to play the Giants. They have to play the Titans. They got the Cardinals. They do have a relatively easy season. So they fix those two lines, and those two lines work out the way that they want them to. They could quite easily make the playoffs. Very easily.
Summer is here, which means we all want to look and feel our best. A GLP-1 may be right for you. Visit orderlymeds.com to learn more about which GLP-1 you could be eligible for. Getting started is fast, easy, and happens virtually through telemedicine from licensed professionals. Check it out for yourself. Go to orderlymeds.com/podcast. That's orderlymeds.com/podcast. Taking care of yourself feels great. Compounded medications are not FDA approved. Eligibility required and determined by a licensed provider. Individual results may vary. See website for details.